The envelope was still in my hand when I stepped out of Rosalind's car. I had been holding it since we left Pemberton Gaines's office, pressing it against my palm like it might disappear if I let go. 17 pages. A Highland Park mansion. $10 million. My grandfather's name on every line and mine beneath it. I had read it 3 times in the car and still couldn't fully place it in my body. That morning, I had woken up a woman who ironed her husband's shirts on Tuesdays. I did not know what I was now, but I felt different. Settled in a way I hadn't felt in years. Then I looked up. Warren was on the porch. Marvine was beside him. Both of them dressed like they had somewhere important to be. Pressed, deliberate, positioned. Warren had papers in his hand. He was standing with his weight forward, chin slightly lifted. I had been married to that man for 17 years. I knew every posture he owned. That one meant he believed he had already won. My name is Gladys Merritt Hale. I am 57 years old. And the afternoon I am about to tell you about is the afternoon everything my grandfather built for me finally made sense. If you are watching this from somewhere that knows what patience costs, drop it in the comments. I want to know where you are. I did not slow down. I did not speed up. I walked to that porch at exactly the same pace I always walked, envelope in hand. And I watched Warren's eyes track the car behind me, Rosalind's car, one he had never seen. And something shifted in his face that he tried to cover before I reached the steps. He didn't cover it fast enough. Gladys. He said my name the way men say it when they want to control the temperature of a room. Then he held out the papers. I need you to look at these. They were divorce papers. I knew before I touched them. The top sheet had an attorney's letterhead I didn't recognize and my full name typed in bold, like a verdict. Warren kept talking. His voice was measured, almost gentle, which was the cruelest version of him. He told me the house had been sold, earnest money accepted, closing date set, and that he needed me gone before it finalized. He had made arrangements. He said that last part like he was doing me a courtesy. Marvine didn't say a single word. She didn't have to. She stood 2 feet to Warren's left with her hands folded and her eyes steady, and her silence was the loudest thing on that porch. I looked at the divorce papers. I looked at Warren. I looked at Marvine. And I laughed. Not a short laugh, not a nervous one, something that rose from somewhere deep and certain, from a place those two had never once touched in 17 years of trying. Warren's composure cracked, just slightly. Just enough. What's funny? I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, actually, the house you sold belonged to. And I stopped, folded the divorce papers with both hands, slid them into my bag beside Pemberton's envelope. You'll hear from my attorney. I turned around, walked back down those porch steps, got into Rosalind's car and pulled the door shut behind me. Rosalind pulled away from the curb without a word. We were 3 blocks gone before she finally spoke. Gladys, what just happened back there? I kept my eyes on the road ahead. The envelope was still in my lap. Pemberton's seal pressed against my fingers. Everything Granddaddy Otis promised me. That morning had started the way most significant mornings do, quietly, with no warning of what it was carrying. Pemberton Gaines's office sat on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old paper and central heat. Dark wood panels, cream curtains that hadn't been changed in 20 years. A grandfather clock in the corner that ticked loud enough to fill the silence between people who had nothing comfortable to say to each other. Pemberton himself sat behind his desk with Otis Merritt's will in both hands, his reading glasses low on his nose, his expression giving away absolutely nothing. There were 6 of us in that room, Rosalind beside me, 2 of my cousins, Darnetta and Clive, across the table with the particular stillness of people who had already decided what they were owed. A family friend who had known Otis for decades. And me, holding my own hands in my lap, trying to breathe normally. Pemberton read slowly. He always read slowly. I think he believed every word deserved the space to land. The early bequests were modest, sentimental items, small, financial gifts. Darnetta shifted in her chair when her name produced a number she clearly hadn't expected. Clive said nothing, but his jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood. The look he got when something wasn't going his way. Then Pemberton reached my name. He paused, just briefly. Then he read, $10 million. The Highland Park Mansion, full ownership of Otis Merritt's remaining financial holdings and investment accounts. To his granddaughter, Gladys Merritt Hale, in full, without condition, effective upon probate closure. Rosalind's hand found mine under the table and gripped so hard my knuckles pressed together. I didn't move. I don't think I breathed. Darnetta's chair scraped back. That can't be right. Her voice was low, but it cut across the room like something thrown. There must be an error. Our grandfather would not have... Pemberton looked up from the document. There is no error. He said it the way a door closes, final, latched. This will was prepared, reviewed, and executed with full legal soundness. It is not open to contest in this room. Clive stood. He and Darnetta left without looking at me. I watched them go and said nothing. I noted the way Darnetta's shoulders were set, rigid, pointed, and I filed it away. When the room cleared, Pemberton asked me to stay. He sat back in his chair and folded his hands. Your grandfather came to me 18 months ago, he said. Before any diagnosis, before any of this. He sat in that same chair you're sitting in, and he told me exactly what he wanted done, and exactly why. He paused. He was not a man who did things without reason, Gladys. You know that. I did know that. He also left you something that isn't in the will. He slid an envelope across the desk. My name on the front in Otis's handwriting. Careful, deliberate, slightly slanted the way it always was. Pemberton stepped out. Rosalind waited in the hall, and I sat alone in that quiet room and opened my grandfather's letter. I am not going to tell you everything it said. Not yet. But I will tell you this. By the time I finished reading, something in my chest had come loose. Not broken. Loose. The way a knot releases when the right pressure finally finds it. I sat with it for a long time. Otis had seen something in my life that I had never said out loud to anyone, and he had answered it, in writing, 18 months before I needed him to. I folded the letter, placed it in my bag beside the will documents, walked out to where Rosalind was waiting and told her to take me home. I wanted to tell Warren myself. I wanted to see his face. I had no idea what was already waiting on that porch. The day I married Warren Hale, Otis walked me down the aisle and squeezed my hand at the altar. Once, firm, the way he did when he was saying something he wouldn't put into words. I thought it was emotion. I was 29 and certain, and I thought it was just an old man trying not to cry at his granddaughter's wedding. I understand that squeeze differently now. Warren was charming in the way that costs nothing to maintain in public. Regional sales director for a commercial logistics firm, the kind of man who knew every person in a room by name within 20 minutes and made each of them feel like the most important conversation he'd had all evening. He was good at surfaces. I mistook that for depth for longer than I should have. The first year, I cataloged small things and told myself they didn't mean what they looked like. The way he steered conversations away from my opinions without appearing to. The way he made decisions about our home, our shared home, and mentioned them to me afterward, not before. Small things. The kind you can convince yourself are adjustments, not patterns. By year 3, he suggested I step back from hospital administration. His schedule was demanding. Someone had to manage the home properly. He said it reasonably, the way he said most things that were not reasonable at all. I had 17 years of experience and a department that needed me. And I set it down like it was nothing because he asked me to, and I believed in the marriage we were building. I stopped calling my colleagues. My friendships thinned without any single moment I could point to. And my time with Otis, the Sunday dinners, the long phone calls, became less frequent because Warren found the old man's directness uncomfortable and made the air in the house dense whenever Otis's name came up too often. I learned to make myself smaller, not all at once, incrementally, the way you adjust to a room getting colder and never notice the temperature until you can see your own breath. Year 5. I tried to go back to work. A hospital in Buckhead had a director position open, and I was qualified, more than qualified. I brought it to Warren over dinner. He looked at me with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite pity. And before he could finish his response, Marvine, who was there for dinner as she was most Sundays, said, "Warren's career is at a critical point, Gladys. This isn't the time for distractions." She said it like she was agreeing with something already decided. Warren said nothing to correct her. I withdrew the application the following morning. I have thought about that dinner more times than I can count. I stayed because I believed people honored their commitments. I told myself the hollow seasons were temporary. Then came year 13. Warren changed in a way that was quiet enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. He started moving money, mentioning account consolidations I hadn't been consulted about, handling all the financial paperwork himself in a way that felt protective until I understood it wasn't protection. It was positioning. He started asking careful questions about Otis, about the estate, about what Otis had and how it was structured. I thought he was being practical. I thought he was planning for our future. He was planning, just not for ours. The porch didn't surprise me the way he wanted it to. What told me everything was the timing, the same day as the will reading. He had been watching Otis. He had been waiting for the right moment. And he had moved the second he believed the window was open. But there was one thing Warren hadn't accounted for. When I laughed on that porch, I watched Marvin's face, and what I saw there wasn't confusion. It was fear, quiet, controlled, and immediate. She had not expected me to laugh. She had built this entire plan on the certainty that I would cry. That fear told me everything about how much she knew, and exactly how badly she had miscalculated. Rosalind drove 3 blocks before she spoke again. "Gladys, talk to me." I was already reaching into my bag, not for an explanation, for Pemberton Gaines's card. I found it beneath the envelope, pulled it out, and dialed before Rosalind finished her sentence. He picked up on the second ring. "Pemberton." My voice came out lower than I intended. Steady, but low. Warren was on the porch when I got home. Divorce papers. He says the house has been sold, earnest money accepted, closing date set. He told me I needed to be gone before it finalized. Silence on his end. Not the silence of someone processing. The silence of someone who already understood the weight of what they were hearing and was choosing their next words carefully. "Come back to my office," he said. "Now." I looked at Rosalind. "Turn around." She turned around without a single question. That is the kind of woman my sister is. Pemberton was standing when we walked in, not behind his desk, but beside it, which I had never seen before. He gestured to the chair across from him and waited until I sat. "2 things you need to understand right now," he said. "First, the Highland Park property has not transferred. Probate hasn't closed. Warren has no knowledge of it, no connection to it, and no legal claim to a single brick of it. Whatever he thinks he knows about your grandfather's estate, he does not know about that." I nodded. "Second," he sat down and turned his computer monitor toward me. "Fulton County property records, our address, the deed to the marital home, the house Warren had just told me was sold. In the state of Georgia, a jointly titled property cannot be legally transferred without both owners signing the deed. Both owners, Gladys. Not one. I leaned forward and read the screen. Gladys Merritt Hale, Warren Hale, both names. Unchanged. Warren handled every piece of financial paperwork in our marriage, I said. I never had reason to pull the deed myself. I know. Pemberton's voice was even, which means one of two things. Either the closing hasn't legally occurred, and he was using the threat to move you out before it could. Or there is a forged signature somewhere in that transaction. Either way, he printed the page and slid it across the desk to me without breaking his sentence. He has a serious problem under Georgia law. I picked up that printed deed and held it in both hands. 17 years of trusting someone with the paperwork. 17 years of believing that a shared life meant shared honesty. And here was my name, still on it, unmoved, exactly where it had always been. Proof that Warren's confidence on that porch was either a bluff or a crime. Possibly both. What I felt looking at that page was not anger. I want to be precise about that. It was certainty. The particular, clarifying certainty of a woman who finally has the document that confirms what her instincts already knew. Pemberton folded his hands on the desk. You need an attorney who handles both family law and fraud. Someone who knows how to move in both directions at once. He paused. I have someone in mind. He picked up his phone and dialed. I sat across from him and listened to him speak in the same measured tone he used for everything. Unhurried, exact. And when he hung up, he looked at me directly. Harriet Vance, we'll see you tomorrow morning at 8. I didn't know that name yet. I didn't know what that name was about to mean for Warren Hale. I nodded. And for the first time since I stepped off that porch, I smiled. It was nothing like the laugh Warren had seen. That laugh was for him. This smile was entirely for me. The office told me everything before the woman said a word. 14th floor, corner position, Midtown Atlanta. Every surface clean in the way that signals intention, not habit. Files in their places. Nothing decorative that wasn't also useful. One framed certificate behind the desk. Centered, level. Not a wall of credentials arranged for intimidation, but a single, quiet statement. I have been doing this long enough that I only need one. Harriet Vance was already standing when I walked in. Tall, composed, somewhere in her mid-50s, with the kind of stillness that doesn't come from calm. It comes from complete control of every room she enters. She shook my hand once, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and sat down. Pemberton called me last night, she said. I've already begun. She listened to my full account without writing a single word. No notepad, no pen, no recorder. Just her eyes on me and her hands folded on the desk, taking in everything I said the way you take in something you intend to use. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she asked her questions. The first, had I signed any document Warren presented to me in the past 6 months? No. The second, was my name on any joint financial account Warren had recently moved or closed? I didn't know. He handled everything. She nodded like that answer was itself an answer. The third question was different. She looked at me directly and asked, how long have you known the marriage was over? Year 7, I said. I stayed anyway. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, not sympathy, something more useful than that. Recognition. She picked up her pen, wrote 4 lines on her notepad, turned it around, and slid it across the desk. Deed fraud, forgery, dissipation of marital assets, conspiracy. She had underlined all 4. Those are possibilities, she said, not conclusions. Right now, I have questions, not answers. Then she tapped the first 2 words with her pen. Gerald Pruitt appears to have processed that listing without proper co-owner documentation, she said. Whether that's negligence, bad procedure, or something worse remains to be seen. I don't have his records yet. I don't have his explanation. What I do have is a transaction that raises serious questions." Her phone buzzed on the desk. She glanced at it, then back at me. "My paralegal. We've started pulling public filings and property records." She read the screen. "The sale has not closed. There is a pending closing date." She set the phone down. 11 days from now." For the first time, I saw something close to satisfaction cross her face. That's enough time to find out exactly what happened. I asked her then, directly because I needed to hear it plainly, what the best outcome looked like. This time she paused. "The honest answer?" she said. "I need records before I make promises." I nodded. She continued. "But if the documents support what you've told me, then the sale can be challenged. The financial transfers can be examined, and if a document examiner determines that signatures were falsified, there can be consequences that extend beyond divorce court." It was a careful answer. A lawyer's answer. And somehow, it gave me more confidence than certainty would have. She stood as I stood. "One more thing." Her voice didn't change register. It never did, but something in it made me stop. "In 22 years of family law in this city, the cases that go furthest wrong for the betraying spouse are usually the ones where the other spouse stayed calm." She held my eyes. "Don't stop being calm." I picked up my bag, walked out through her door, down 14 floors, and out into the Atlanta morning. I felt like a woman who had already won. I just had to let the process catch up. Wileen Dorsey had already cooked before I called to say I was coming. That was the thing about her. She didn't wait to be told something was wrong. She felt it move through whatever invisible thread connected us, and she went to her kitchen and she cooked. Smothered chicken, cornbread, something on the stove that smelled exactly like her grandmother's house on Hollis Street. Which is to say, it smelled like safety. I sat down at her kitchen table, and for the first time in 4 days, I exhaled completely. I told her everything. The will reading, Pemberton's office, the figures, the letter, the porch, Warren standing there like a man collecting a debt, Marvin's silence, the divorce papers, the laugh that came out of me from somewhere I couldn't fully explain, Harriet Vance and the 11 days and the 4 words on the notepad. All of it, in the order it happened, without managing how it sounded. Wileen listened the way she had always listened, not performing concern, not preparing her response while I was still talking. Just present. Completely, quietly present. When I finished, she didn't speak immediately. She got up, refilled both our glasses, set mine in front of me, and sat back down. She folded her hands on the table and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I should have told you years ago." I waited. 4 years back. That gathering at your cousin Nettie's house, the one Warren didn't come to. She paused. "Your grandfather pulled me outside, just the 2 of us, off the back porch, and he asked me directly. He said, 'Wileen, is Gladys happy?' The kitchen was very quiet. I told him the truth. I told him you were managing, that you were holding everything together the way you always did. But that managing and happy weren't the same thing, and anybody paying attention could see the difference." She looked down at her hands. He didn't say anything back, just nodded once and went inside. I thought maybe I'd overstepped. I never brought it up again. I sat with that for a long moment. Otis hadn't restructured his estate because he got sick. He'd done it because of a conversation on a back porch 4 years ago, because Wileen told him the truth about my life when I hadn't been able to tell it to myself. He had taken that one honest answer and turned it into a mansion and $10 million and a letter that broke something loose in my chest. He saw it. Before I could name it, before I could admit it, before I had the language for what my life had become, he saw it, and he planned accordingly. I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment, so I didn't. Wileen let the silence sit. She was good at that. Then she said, "There's one more thing." I looked up. About 8 months ago, I was at Garrison's in Buckhead, that new place on Peachtree. She kept her eyes on mine. Warren was there, back corner table, and he was not alone. She said it plainly, without drama. "Young woman." The way he was leaning toward her, that wasn't business, Gladys. That wasn't casual. I didn't say anything because I didn't have proof and I didn't want to bring you something I couldn't stand behind. She slid a small piece of paper across the table. The restaurant name, the date. I picked it up, took out my phone, and before I stood up from that table, I had already texted it to Harriet Vance. Harriet responded in under 2 minutes. It simply said, "Noted. This helps." Harriet called on a Monday morning and I heard it immediately. That particular edge in her voice, controlled and precise, that I had already learned meant the ground was shifting in our direction. "Come in at noon," she said. "Pruitt's records are here." I was at her office at 11:45. The conference table had been cleared except for one thick folder positioned in the center. Harriet stood beside it rather than behind her desk, the way she stood when she wanted me to see something rather than just hear it. She opened the folder and laid the documents out in order. The listing agreement, the purchase offer, the contract. Each one lined up with the careful precision of someone building a case brick by brick. "Look at the seller's signature line on every document," she said. I looked. Warren's signature on every page. Clean, consistent, confident. And on the co-owner line, the line that should have carried my name, 2 of the documents were blank. The third had a signature. I leaned closer. "That is supposed to be mine," I said. "I know." Harriet's voice didn't waver. "My document examiner completed a preliminary review. Based on the samples we've provided, that signature does not appear to match your verified handwriting. The letter spacing is different. The pressure pattern is different. The slant is different." She paused. "The examiner's opinion is that you very likely did not sign that document." I straightened up slowly. Something cold moved through me. Not shock, because somewhere beneath everything I had already suspected this, but the particular chill of having suspicion confirmed on paper. "Terrence Falk," Harriet continued, "is currently maintaining that Warren and Pruitt told him the co-owner consent issue was resolved. His attorney presented that position to me last week." She pulled a single printed email from beneath the folder and placed it on top of the stack. "Then I sent his attorney this." I read it. Warren's name sat in the sender line. Falk's in the recipient. 6 weeks before the porch. The language wasn't openly incriminating. That was what made it interesting. Warren repeatedly pushed for speed. He emphasized that the transaction was straightforward, that unnecessary delays would only complicate matters, and that he preferred a closing process that remained efficient and uncomplicated. Nothing in the email explicitly acknowledged a problem. Nothing directly admitted wrongdoing. But reading it alongside the disputed signature and the incomplete documents, the tone felt different. Falk's response was brief, 3 sentences. He agreed. He asked no questions. He proceeded. "He knew something wasn't right," I said. Harriet folded her hands. "At minimum, he ignored several reasons to ask obvious questions. That's not the same thing as planning a fraud. But it creates a very serious problem when you're participating in a transaction that later turns out to involve one." She closed the folder. "I sent this to his attorney 48 hours ago. This morning, Falk agreed to unwind the transaction and provide a full cooperative statement. He will not be a problem." I asked what that meant for Falk going forward. Harriet's expression was unchanged. A man facing potential civil exposure tends to become very cooperative very quickly, especially when the alternative is explaining every decision under oath. She moved back to her desk and pulled up something on her screen. "There's something else." Her tone shifted, not dramatically, but enough that I straightened in my chair. "When we reviewed the transaction records produced so far, one thing stood out. The earnest money wasn't deposited into any joint account associated with both of you. It went into an account registered solely in Warren's name. She turned the monitor slightly toward me. An account I have no record of you ever being associated with. I stared at the screen. How long has that account existed? That, she said, is exactly what we are going to find out. She looked up from the monitor and held my eyes. If the records are complete, then Warren has been moving money through an account you knew nothing about. This may go significantly deeper than the house. The room was very quiet. Outside, 14 floors below, Atlanta moved on without any awareness of what was unraveling in that office. I sat with that for exactly one breath. Then I told her to find everything. There is a particular kind of man who keeps records the way other men keep weapons. Not out of professionalism, not out of principle, but out of the cold. Understanding that one day he may need something to trade. Gerald Pruitt was exactly that kind of man. And the morning his attorney delivered 3 years of communication logs to Harriet's office, it was the single most useful thing Gerald Pruitt had ever done in his life. Harriet had everything laid out on the conference table by the time I arrived. She didn't greet me at the door. She was already seated, already working through the chronology, and she simply looked up and said, "Sit down. You need to see this in order." We went through it from the beginning. The first contact about listing the marital home did not come from Warren. It came from a number registered to Marvin Hale, placed directly to Pruitt's personal cell, not his office line, not his business email, but his personal cell, which meant she already had it, which meant this was not a cold call. 6 weeks before the will reading. 8 weeks before Warren stood on that porch with divorce papers in his hand and certainty in his posture. I sat with that for a long moment. Warren was the face of it. The one who held the papers. The one who delivered the lines. But Marvin made the first call. She had been the one to set everything in motion before Warren had taken a single visible step. The subsequent communications told the rest of it. Marvin coordinating the listing timeline with Pruitt directly, asking about closing projections, pushing for speed. The entire architecture of the sale had her fingerprints on it from the first exchange. And running through all of it was a single assumption that neither of them had ever thought to question. That whatever Otis Merritt left behind, it would not be enough to change anything. That Gladys would inherit modestly or nothing, and that the sale of the marital home would leave her with no ground to stand on. They had built the entire plan on not knowing what Otis had prepared. Harriet stopped on one particular text. She read it aloud without preface. Gladys generally prefers keeping the peace. I don't expect much resistance. Marvin to Pruitt. Sent 4 weeks before the porch. I was completely still for 10 full seconds. I counted them without meaning to. Then I said, "Add Marvin Hale as a named party in the civil fraud claim." Harriet wrote it down without a word. She didn't tell me to think about it. She didn't soften the implications. She wrote it down because it was the correct legal response, and we both knew it. I understood something fully in that moment that I had only understood partially before. This was never simply Warren wanting out of a marriage. That would have been painful, but it would have been human. This was Warren and his mother, together, deliberately and methodically planning to strip me of everything: my home, my stability, my ability to stand, and timing it with precision, and building it on 17 years of watching me make myself smaller so that everyone around me could be more comfortable. They had watched me accommodate, and they had counted on me to keep doing it. Harriet closed the communication file and opened something else on her screen. "The expanded civil conspiracy claim goes in by end of week," she said. "But there's something else." She pulled up the hidden account transactions, the ones we had found redirected from Fox earnest money. 14 months of transfers. Several of the largest ones go to the same recipient. Consistently. She turned the screen toward me and pointed to a name. I had never met her, but I knew the name. Camille Reese. I want to be precise about something before I tell you this part. I am not a woman who wastes anger on another woman. Camille Reese did not stand before God and a room full of people and make promises to me. Warren did. Whatever she knew or didn't know about his marriage was his responsibility to disclose, not hers to investigate. I made that decision about where to place my anger early, and I did not revisit it. What the financial records showed about Camille Reese was not personal to me. It was evidence. I treated it exactly as that. Harriet's forensic accountant had been working the hidden account for 4 days by the time she walked me through the full picture. 14 months of transfers, mapped and categorized. A leased apartment in Midtown, monthly payments consistent over the entire period. Jewelry purchases, 3 of them, significant. Travel expenses to cities Warren had told me were work trips. And beyond all of that, a recurring monthly deposit that looked less like gifts and more like a budget, a household budget, the kind you set up when you are maintaining a life, not conducting an affair. Warren was not a man who had strayed. He was a man who had been building a destination. The total figure, when the accountant finalized it, represented a significant portion of what Georgia law considered marital assets. Harriet explained it plainly. Deliberate dissipation of marital assets in anticipation of divorce can influence how marital property is ultimately divided. She added the full amount to our claim without ceremony. The way you add a column of numbers that were always going to be there. Warren's attorney pushed back within the week. The transfers were personal expenditures, loans between consenting adults, unrelated to any divorce planning. His attorney presented this argument in writing, and I imagine it looked reasonable on paper to someone who hadn't seen the messages produced during discovery. Harriet had the messages. Conversations between Warren and Camille that were specific enough to remove every shred of ambiguity. Discussions about the life he intended to build after the divorce. The timeline he was working toward. What he expected to have in place before everything became official. The loans argument did not survive contact with those messages. It collapsed the same week it was presented. 2 days later, Harriet received a letter from an attorney representing Camille Reese directly. She read me the relevant portion across the conference table. Camille Reese would not be providing any testimony or statement on Warren Hale's behalf. She was not a party to these proceedings and did not intend to become one. The letter closed with a single line. That her client considered all matters between herself and Mr. Hale to be fully and finally concluded. Fully and finally concluded. The Midtown apartment had already been vacated. The monthly deposits had stopped after the hidden account became part of the ongoing litigation. The parallel life Warren had funded and furnished and kept ready for 14 months had dissolved faster than he could have anticipated. And he was now calling a phone number that went straight to voicemail every single time. I processed all of this without satisfaction. What I felt instead was something cleaner and more useful than satisfaction. A complete, unobstructed understanding of who Warren Hale actually was. Not a man who had fallen out of love. A man who had kept perfect attendance at our life. The dinners, the functions, the ordinary Tuesdays, while quietly building his exit, funded by money that was partly mine. The clarity didn't hurt anymore. It informed. Harriet looked up from her notes. "He's called your phone twice." "I know," I said. I didn't answer. "Don't." She set her pen down. "And don't listen to those messages without me present." She paused. "He's starting to understand what he's facing. That's when they get reckless or desperate." She looked at me steadily. Warren Hale strikes me as the desperate kind. I filed that away. I would be ready either way. Harriet filed on a Wednesday. Because the closing date was still inside 11 days, she filed for emergency temporary restraining order status. A mechanism Georgia courts take seriously when a fraudulent property transfer is imminent and documented. She didn't ask my permission before filing. She called me afterward, told me what she had done and what would happen next, and told me to stay available. By Thursday morning, Warren Hale had been served with 3 documents simultaneously: the emergency TRO motion, the expanded civil fraud complaint naming him Marvine Hale and Gerald Pruitt, and a formal criminal referral package prepared for submission to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office regarding the deed and signature issues. I thought about his face when that landed. Then I stopped thinking about it and focused on what came next. The TRO hearing moved quickly. The judge reviewed the deed, the flagged signature, the communications surrounding the transaction, and Falk's cooperative statement. 72 hours after Harriet filed, the motion was granted. The pending sale was legally frozen. The marital home was restored to protected joint ownership pending full divorce settlement proceedings. The closing date Warren had been counting on came and went without a single document transferring. The deed didn't move. It never had. Gerald Pruitt, now facing the civil complaint and a formal Georgia Real Estate Commission investigation running parallel, made the only calculation available to him. His attorney contacted Harriet, and within days, Pruitt had provided a complete sworn statement. He confirmed that Marvin Hale initiated the listing. He confirmed that Warren Hale represented his wife had given consent when she had not. He confirmed every material fact that Harriet needed confirmed. He was the first domino, and he fell completely. Warren's attorney filed a counter-motion the following week, arguing that the signature had been verbally authorized. I read that argument and felt something close to contempt. Not for Warren's desperation, which I understood, but for the assumption underneath it, that a court would accept verbal authorization as a substitute for a legal signature on a property deed. Harriet's written response dismantled it in 48 hours. The counter-motion was denied. The criminal referral moved on its own timetable. Harriet submitted everything: the disputed signature, the transaction records, the statements, the financial trail. Then we waited. Not forever. Just long enough to remember that criminal investigations move differently than civil cases. Several weeks later, a detective from the Fulton County District Attorney's Investigative Division contacted Harriet and requested an interview. I went in on a Thursday morning, sat across a plain desk in a plain room, and gave my statement calmly and completely. I brought a copy of Otis's letter, not because anyone required it, but because I wanted it on record that I came from something solid, that no one had taken anything from me, that I had been standing on ground that belonged to me from the moment I walked out of Pemberton's office. The original letter stayed in my bag. It had been there since the day Pemberton handed it to me, and I saw no reason to change that. Warren called my cell that afternoon. This time I answered. Harriet was beside me, and the call was on speaker with his knowledge. He sounded like a man who had not slept in days. His voice had that particular thinness that comes from too many hours of too little rest and too much realizing. He told me he had made a mistake. I told him I agreed. I thanked him for calling. I ended the call. Harriet nodded once. That was enough. That evening, Pemberton called. Probate on Otis's estate was moving faster than the standard timeline. He expected the Highland Park mansion could transfer to my name within 3 weeks. I put the phone down and looked out the window of Rosalind's guest room, where I had been staying since the day of the porch, my belongings retrieved from the marital home earlier that week through Harriet's office. I had not needed to go back myself. I had not needed to stand in those rooms again. I looked at the Atlanta skyline and felt 3 weeks suddenly feel very close. Probate closed on a Tuesday. Pemberton called at 8:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had been awake since 6, and I had been watching my phone without admitting to myself that I was watching it. When it finally rang, I let it ring twice before I answered. Old habit. Composed entry. He told me the keys were ready. He asked if I wanted him to meet me there. I told him no. I wanted to go the first time alone. I had been past that house before, many times, though never recently. As a child, Otis used to drive me through Highland Park on Sunday afternoons without explanation. He never pointed at the house directly. He would simply slow the car and let me look, and when I had looked long enough, he would drive on. I was young enough to accept this without question, and old enough to understand that he was showing me something he wasn't ready to say. I had thought about those drives across the years, in quiet moments, in the years of the marriage when quiet moments were the only space that was fully mine. I thought about them now as I turned into the driveway and put the car in park. I sat for a few minutes. Just sat. Then I got out, walked to the front door, and put the key in the lock. The door opened, and the smell reached me before anything else. Old books and cedar, and something underneath both of those, a stillness that wasn't emptiness, but preservation. The particular atmosphere of a place that had been loved carefully for a very long time by someone who understood that love was mostly maintenance, showing up, paying attention, not letting things decay. It smelled like Otis. I had told Rosalind where I was going. My phone was in my pocket. But there was nothing here that required caution, only rooms that had been waiting. I walked through all of them slowly. The front sitting room with its tall windows, the dining room with chairs still positioned as though someone had just risen from the table. The kitchen, practical, clean, organized the way Otis organized everything, which was to say with complete confidence about where each thing belonged. I ran my hand along the counter and felt the specific grief of understanding how much of my own life I had spent arranging myself around other people's certainty instead of building my own. I had made myself smaller for 17 years, incrementally, carefully, so gradually that I hadn't noticed the full shape of it until I was standing in these rooms where no one had ever asked me to shrink. I found the study at the end of the hall. Dark wood desk. Bookshelves, floor to ceiling. His chair, leather, worn at the arms, positioned to face the window and the street below. And on the desk, in a simple wooden frame that had clearly been there for years, a photograph. I picked it up. It was me, 12 years old, maybe 13, standing in the front yard of this house, squinting into the sun with my whole face open, laughing at something off camera. I turned it over. Otis's handwriting. Careful, slightly slanted, deliberate. She doesn't know it yet, but this will be hers. A date beneath it. 31 years ago. I sat down in his chair. And for the first time since the afternoon on that porch, through all the meetings and the documents and the legal machinery and the controlled breathing, I cried. Not from pain, not from grief. From the specific, unlocking relief of being completely known by someone. He had seen the whole shape of my life before I had lived it. He had written it down and framed it and left it on his desk where I would find it. I sat with that for a long time. Then I took out my phone and called Wileen. She picked up on the second ring. "I'm in Otis's study," I said, "in Highland Park." A pause. Then, "He always said you'd find your way there." I looked out the window at the street below, the same street he used to slow the car on so I could look. "Tell me when you can come," I said. "I want to show you every room." I did not watch Warren's collapse happen in real time. I heard about it the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in, secondhand, without urgency. The way information arrives when it no longer has the power to hurt you. Harriet called with updates. Wileen called with what was moving through the circles she still occupied. I listened to both of them the same way, carefully, completely, and without letting any of it take up more space than it deserved. The civil filings and criminal referral reached Warren's professional world before any formal charges were filed. Atlanta moves that way in certain networks. A publicly filed fraud complaint and a referral to the DA's office can travel faster than any press release. Questions began appearing in places where Warren had never had to answer questions before. 2 of the regional account relationships he had spent years cultivating at the logistics firm became noticeably quieter inside of a week. No confrontation, no explanation, just delayed calls, postponed meetings, and the particular distance people create when they are uncertain what comes next. A man who had built his entire identity on how he appeared to other people was watching that appearance develop fractures he had no tools to repair. Terrence Falk's cooperative statement became part of the public civil record. His account was unambiguous. Warren Hale as the primary initiator, Falk as a buyer who maintained he had been misled about the consent issue. Falk reached a civil resolution, provided his statement, and walked away from the wreckage he had helped build. Warren had no one left to share the weight with. Every person who had participated in the scheme had either cooperated against him or disappeared entirely. Then Warren made one final attempt to regain control. His attorney sent Harriet a proposal before any formal settlement discussions began. It framed everything as a misunderstanding. The disputed signature issue was described as a documentation dispute. The hidden account was characterized as private spending. If I agreed to a quiet divorce and withdrew the civil claims, Warren was willing to make what his attorney called a reasonable financial accommodation. Harriet read the proposal once and handed it to me. "What do you think?" she asked. I read it carefully. 17 years together. The disputed documents, the hidden money, the planned sale of the house, and somehow the proposal still treated me like a woman who could be managed. I handed it back. "No." Harriet nodded once. "I thought so." The proposal expired 3 days later. Then Marvine retained her own attorney. Harriet told me this on a Wednesday morning with the same even tone she used for everything, but I understood immediately what it meant. Marvine's attorney filed a statement within days, formally and legally distinguishing her role from Warren's, characterizing her involvement as peripheral and his as directive, and offering limited cooperation in connection with the civil proceedings. Her own son. She had built the architecture of his ambush, and when the structure began collapsing, she retained separate counsel and pointed toward him. Her settlement was negotiated independently. She paid her portion of the civil damages. And through her attorney, she provided a written acknowledgement of her role in initiating the listing contact with Gerald Pruitt. It was not worded as an apology. It was worded as a legal statement of fact. But it would follow her. In the court record, in the permanent file, in every future context where her name came up in connection with these events. She had wanted to leave me with nothing. What she left instead was a document with her name on it. Darnetta and Clive, my cousins, whose cold exit from Pemberton's office I had noted and filed away on the morning of the will reading, had quietly positioned themselves near Warren's narrative in the weeks following. I heard this through Wileen, who heard it through the particular grapevine that connects Atlanta families who have known each other too long. They had apparently decided that Warren's version of events was the more useful one to align with, but Warren's version had no structural support left. Their alignment had purchased them nothing except proximity to a man facing increasingly serious legal and financial problems. I noted this. I moved on. I was living in Otis's house. I had rooms to inhabit and decisions to make and a life to reconstruct that was entirely my own. Warren Hale's world was contracting by the day, and I was not required to watch it happen. Harriet called on a Friday afternoon. "His attorney reached out," she said. "Informal settlement conversation. He wants to negotiate before the divorce proceedings move further." A pause. "He's seen the full scope now. He knows what's coming." I asked her what she wanted to do. "Let him come to the table," she said. "Let him sit across from us with everything in front of him. Let him see exactly what he's facing with witnesses present." I told her to schedule it. Harriet called on a Monday morning and said 4 words before anything else. "I need Rosalind's statement." She explained what she wanted, a formal, sworn account covering the will reading, the drive to the marital home, and everything Rosalind witnessed on that porch. I called Rosalind before I was off the phone with Harriet. She picked up, and I had barely finished the sentence before she said, "Tell me when and where." She had been waiting to be asked. Harriet was deliberate about one thing. She didn't want me present during the statement. She wanted Rosalind's account uninfluenced, unshared, drawn entirely from her own observation, without any unconscious alignment to what I might have already told her. I understood the reasoning, and I agreed without argument. I sat in Harriet's waiting area for 2 hours while my sister sat in the conference room with the paralegal and said everything she had seen. When the printed statement was placed in my hands, I read it slowly. Rosalind had always been a careful observer. Quieter than me, more precise in the way she cataloged things. I had known this about her our entire lives. What I hadn't fully understood until that moment was how much she had been watching on a day I thought I was the only one paying attention. The first significant detail was from the porch. Rosalind noted that when she pulled the car to the curb, Marvin was holding a phone and appeared to be in the final seconds of a call. The body language of someone wrapping up, not simply standing. By the time I stepped out of the car, the phone was at her side. Rosalind had watched Marvin's hand move and noted the timing precisely because something about it felt deliberate, coordinated, like a woman who had just confirmed something and was now taking her position. It was a small detail in isolation. In context, it placed Marvin in active communication with someone, Warren's attorney, Pruitt, or another party. At the exact moment the ambush was being executed, not a woman who had shown up to support her son. A woman who had been managing the operation until I stepped out of a car she didn't recognize, and the plan began to unravel. The second detail surprised even Rosalind. While giving her statement, Harriet's paralegal had asked whether there had ever been anything in the years before Otis's death that, looking back now, felt unusual. Rosalind sat with the question for a long time. Then she remembered something neither of us had thought about in years. At a family gathering roughly 3 years earlier, she had stepped away from the main room to answer a call. Before she announced herself, she overheard part of a conversation between Warren and Marvin. Not enough to understand its full context. Just a few sentences that seemed meaningless at the time. Marvin said she had heard Otis Merritt was restructuring parts of his estate. Warren replied, "I'll handle it." Then, after a pause, he said something else. "If he's moving things around, I need to know what's changing." Rosalind remembered it only because, sitting in Harriet's office and looking at everything that had happened since, the words suddenly sounded different than they had 3 years ago. Harriet added a note beneath this section of the statement in her own handwriting. That the recollection standing alone was not evidence of wrongdoing, but positioned against the documents, timelines, financial transfers, and communications already established, it helped explain why Warren's behavior appeared to change during that same period. It was context, not proof. But context matters when the rest of the structure is already standing. I set the statement down. 3 years ago. Which meant the timeline tracked directly to what I had noticed in Warren around year 13 of our marriage. The financial repositioning, the careful questions about Otis, the quietness that felt like planning. It wasn't a difficult season. It was a response to information he had gathered. He heard something about Otis's estate, and he started moving. The last question I had carried quietly, whether Warren had once genuinely loved me and simply changed over time, dissolved completely. The conference room was Harriet's in every sense that mattered. Her building, her floor, her table, long, dark, positioned so that whoever sat at the far end understood they were a guest in someone else's domain. Warren and his attorney were already seated when Harriet and I walked in. I noted that immediately. They had arrived first and taken the far side, which meant they had been sitting there waiting for us. And there is a particular psychological cost to being the ones who wait. I sat down across from Warren Hale for the first time since the afternoon on that porch. He had aged. Not dramatically, not in the way of someone broken, but in the specific way of a man who had not been sleeping well and had been doing a great deal of sitting alone with what he had set in motion. The certainty was gone from his posture. What replaced it was a careful stillness that I recognized as controlled anxiety dressed as composure. Harriet opened without preamble. The marital home to Gladys, outright, as part of the settlement terms. A disproportionate division of marital assets reflecting the deliberate dissipation of funds. The forensic accountant's figures were already in the record, and they were not contestable. A portion of Warren's retirement accounts. The civil fraud claim resolved through settlement rather than proceeding to trial. And one item that was not on the table because it was not Harriet's to offer. The criminal referral to the Fulton County DA, which would proceed independently of anything signed in this room today. Warren's attorney pushed back on 2 points: the asset division figure and the retirement account percentage. Harriet responded to each with specific documents already in the record. The forensic accountant's final report on the first, and the text message evidence establishing deliberate divorce planning on the second. The pushback lasted 11 minutes. Then it ended. Warren was silent through most of it. He looked at the table. He looked occasionally at his attorney. He did not look at me once. Then he did. He turned toward me directly, not toward Harriet, not toward the documents, but toward me. And he said, "I never wanted it to go this far." I let him finish. Then I looked at him steadily and said, "I believe you. You didn't want it to go this far. You wanted me to fold on that porch and make it easy." I kept my voice completely level. The reason it went this far is that I didn't fold. He had nothing to say to that. He turned back to the table. His attorney signed first, then Warren. The pen moved across the signature line the way all inevitable things eventually move, not dramatically, just finely. Harriet signed. Then she slid the document to me, and I signed last. I set the pen down. Gerald Pruitt's license. Suspended. Pending the commission's full investigation. Terrence Falk's restitution. Cleared. Marvine's civil damages. Paid. Her written acknowledgement already in the permanent record. The marital home. Mine. Every thread that had been pulled apart over the past weeks had been gathered and tied. The one that remained open belonged to the DA's office and would resolve on its own timeline without any action required from me. I picked up my copy of the signed settlement and put it in my bag, the same bag that had carried Otis's letter from Pemberton's office on the morning this all began. The letter in one pocket, the settlement in another. I thought about that for a moment, about what it meant to carry both of them in the same space. And I said nothing. Some things don't require words. Harriet and I rode the elevator down in silence. At the lobby, she said, "The DA's office confirmed this morning. They're moving forward." The elevator opened. Atlanta was outside, bright, ordinary, entirely indifferent to what had just concluded 14 floors above it. People moving, traffic, the city continuing as it always did. I walked out into it. 6 weeks after the settlement, I was sitting in Otis's chair with my coffee going warm in my hands, and nowhere I needed to be. The study windows face east. On Sunday mornings, the light comes in at an angle that turns everything gold. The desk, the bookshelves, the worn leather arms of the chair I had claimed as my own. The afternoon I first sat in it and cried. I had learned the light patterns of every room in this house by now. The way the kitchen caught the afternoon. The way the front sitting room went quiet and blue at dusk. A house reveals itself slowly to the people who pay attention, and I had been paying attention to every inch of it. Wileen was coming for lunch. Rosalind was bringing her family in the afternoon. Pemberton had called twice this week. Investment conversations, options for the inheritance, questions about what I wanted to build going forward. I had spent the first call mostly listening. The second call I had spent talking. 30 years in hospital administration before Warren suggested I step back. 30 years of managing budgets and departments and people and outcomes. And it had not left me. It had simply been waiting in the same way this house had been waiting. Pemberton seemed unsurprised by how quickly it came back. I was not surprised either. Not anymore. I carried my coffee through the rooms the way I had started doing on weekend mornings. Slowly, without destination. The hall table held a photograph of my mother I had brought from storage 3 weeks ago. Her face, at roughly the age I was now, looking directly at the camera with an expression I finally understood. The study shelves held my books alongside Otis's, the spines mixing without conflict the way things mix when they were always meant to share a space. I had not changed what he built. I had added myself to it. There was a difference, and I felt it every morning. Back at the desk, my phone lit up. A notification from the Fulton County DA's office. I read it once, completely, without rushing. The case against Warren Hale had been formally accepted for prosecution. I set the phone face down on the desk, picked up my coffee. Warren had made every choice that led to a room in the DA's office. I had made every choice that led to this room in Highland Park. I had not engineered his consequence. I had told the truth, kept my composure, and allowed the law to function as it was designed to. What happened to him now was the direct result of what he had done, moving at the speed court's move, arriving exactly where it was always going to arrive. I opened the top drawer and took out Otis's letter, the original. Carried in my bag from the morning Pemberton handed it to me through every meeting and motion and signed document, and now kept in this drawer where I could reach it without looking. I had read it many times. I read it again. He wrote that he had watched me give myself away piece by piece across the years, and that it broke his heart in the quiet way things break when you love someone and cannot intervene. He wrote that he could not fix what I had chosen to endure, but he could make sure I had somewhere solid to land when I was finally ready. He wrote that the house had always been waiting for me, that I was the one he trusted to carry the Merit name forward into whatever came next, that he was proud of me in ways he had never been good at saying out loud. I folded the letter, set it back in the drawer. I sat in the morning light and let the full weight of it settle, not just the past weeks, but the 17 years before them, and the woman I had been inside those years, and the woman sitting in this chair now. I did not feel like someone who had survived something. I felt like a woman who had always been capable of exactly this, who had simply needed the space to prove it. Wileen's car turned into the driveway. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked to the window. Below, she stepped out and looked up at the house the way you look at something you have waited a long time to see. Head tilted back slightly, taking the whole of it in. I watched her face and felt something settle completely in my chest. I set my coffee down and went to open the door. Granddaddy Otis used to say the patient ones inherit everything. I finally know what he meant.